from a variety of backgrounds, from EU institutions, intelligence services, NGOs, government, and beyond. You are all very welcome. I'm delighted to introduce you to this discussion on how algorithmic amplification pushes users toward divisive content on social media platforms. I think it is an extremely topical issue, and one that the Counter-Extremism Project has been involved in highlighting for quite some time now. CEP, the Counter-Extremism Project, is, as you know, the host of this webinar. I'm a senior advisor with CEP in Europe. And just for those of you who are not so familiar with our organization, we are a non-profit, non-partisan international organization which aims to counter the threat of extremist ideologies and terrorism globally. We deploy all sorts of tools, education, advocacy, communication tools, which are designed to inform the public at large, media, academia, business leaders, and of course policymakers about the dangers posed by extremist ideologies and movements, as well as recruitment and operational tactics. So we, in Europe, we are based in Brussels. We coordinate our activities across the EU and indeed non-EU countries. We have offices, in addition to Brussels, in London and Berlin, partners in France, Spain, Italy, and across other member states as well. And we are extremely involved in organizing events such as this, projects at community level. And we also, and I need to plug it, host a bi-monthly podcast called Fighting Terror, where we explore a range of relevant topics with leading policymakers and academics. So you are welcome to download that and listen to it on your platform of choice. So today, as you know, our topic is algorithmic amplification. We are delighted to be joined by a CEP advisor and professor at UC Berkeley, Dr. Hany Farid, who is a senior CEP advisor, as I said, and somebody who has really worked very closely with the team in Europe over the past number of years in tackling online extremist and harmful content. I'm also delighted to be joined by Tiemo, Wölken, an S&D member of the European Parliament, and Prabhat Agarwal from DG Connect at the European Commission. Mr. Wölken is the coordinator within the Committee on Legal Affairs and rapporteur, most appropriately, for the Digital Single Market Act, Digital Market Act, and somebody who is extremely well briefed on the forthcoming regulation. And Mr. Agarwal is the head of e-commerce and platforms unit within DG Connect, and is also, of course, has been notably involved in drafting the Digital Service Act. So we really look forward to hearing from both of you and having you share your insights with us. We're going to explore the nature and extent of the global phenomenon of misinformation, the role of algorithmic amplification in spreading it, the consequences, as well as obviously policy and regulatory solutions. So without further ado, I will hand over to Dr. Farid, who will talk us through his experience in this area, what the business models are, and also some of the potential solutions. So I'm going to hand over to you, Hany, and very much look forward to hearing your initial thoughts.
Thank you, Lucinda, and thanks to the Counter-Extremism Project for organizing this. I think that the timing of this couldn't be any more urgent given what we have been seeing around the world, particularly what we saw on January 6th here in the United States. So what I'm going to try to do is set the stage a little bit for this conversation. And I'm going to start, I think, probably saying some things that are relatively obvious, but I think they still warrant saying them out loud to make sure that we're all on the same page. So let's start with, what is the business model of social media? Well, social media, of course, makes money primarily through paid advertising. So advertisers pay to place ads in front of users. And by tracking our online patterns, both on and off their platform, and building very, very detailed profiles of us, Facebook, for example, can offer highly targeted advertising based on your age, your race, your gender, your political affiliation, your religion, your hobbies, your likes, your dislikes, your medical conditions, your physical location, and anything you can imagine that they can extract from the pattern of online data that you have freely given them. This ad targeting, of course, can be so specific that Facebook's ad network can be used for what people are called sniper targeting, where ads can be customized to a single individual out of the some 3 billion or so worldwide users. And again, it's important to understand this basic business model because it drives day-to-day operations on social media and the things that we are going to talk about today. At its core, platforms are financially incentivized to keep you on their webpage or app for as long as possible because it extracts more data from you to refine those advertising profiles, allowing them to deliver more and more and more highly targeted ads. So in this regard, I would argue that social media is not dissimilar from the tobacco industry, who are incentivized to keep you addicted to their products and whose product in moderation may not be that bad for you, but in excess, as we have seen here in the US, in Europe, and around the world, it can be deadly. Okay, so that's the core business model: advertising, user engagement, maximize. So what's the impact of this? What do we have to worry about here? Okay, so every day, 4 petabytes, that's 4 million gigabytes of data are uploaded to Facebook every single day, 365 days a year. But not all of that content is equal in the eyes of Facebook. Starting in 2009, so more than 10 years ago, Facebook eliminated the ability to chronologically sort the news feed and instead turned over editorial control to algorithmic curation. So similarly, it's easy to pick on Facebook, but every minute of every day, more than 500 hours of video are uploaded to YouTube. Every minute, 500 hours. But the likelihood that any single video is widely seen depends largely on recommendation algorithms, because on YouTube, a full 70% of what is watched, 70, is recommended by the company's algorithms. And by 2016, Twitter and Instagram joined Facebook and YouTube in unleashing attention-grabbing recommendation algorithms to control what you read, see, hear, and ultimately, let's face it, believe. Now, the titans of tech relinquish control to recommendation algorithms because these algorithms can better manipulate users, maximizing clicks, likes, shares, and in turn, of course, profits. So this algorithmic amplification, I argue, is the root cause of the unprecedented speed and reach with which hate, divisiveness, misinformation, and conspiracies are spreading online. Now, Mark Zuckerberg is fond of saying over and over again, he doesn't want to be the arbiter of truth. Fair enough. But here's the thing that he's not telling you is that he is. He may not be specifically the arbiter of truth, but he is the arbiter of what you see, hear, and eventually believe every minute of every day on Instagram and on Facebook. And frankly, other tech CEOs wield that same powers because their algorithms are plucking specific pieces of information to put in front of you. And if they do that, they can't say, well, this isn't my responsibility. I'm not the arbiter of truth. They absolutely 100% are. Okay, that's the business model. That's why we have algorithmic amplification, because it maximizes engagement and profits. Okay, so what does this mean for us? Well, the classic philosophical thought exercise asks, if a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? The modern equivalent of that, the internet equivalent of that, should ask, if information is on Facebook and an algorithm doesn't promote it onto a newsfeed, does it even exist? Facebook's own internal research found, and I quote here, our algorithms exploit the human brain's attraction to divisiveness. Their own research went on to conclude that if left unchecked, Facebook's recommendation algorithms will promote, and I quote again, more and more divisive content in an effort to gain user attention and increase time on the platform. A separate internal Facebook study found that 64% of people who joined an extremist group on Facebook did so because of the company's recommendation. Facebook leadership chose to simply ignore these research findings. Put simply, the recommendation algorithms have learned that users respond to outrage, sensational material, and have learned to promote this material because it maximizes user engagement and in turn ad revenue. And we can't pretend otherwise. This is incontrovertible. Okay, so this is the landscape that we are facing with, is we have these now trillion-dollar companies with mega monopolies that are globally centered, and their algorithms are driving engagement by driving divisiveness, conspiracy, outrage, misinformation, because frankly, it makes them a lot of money. So what are the interventions? What are we left with? We're here not to gripe about Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook. We're here to talk about solutions. So let's talk a little bit about that. I'll create some scaffolding. So first, I think it's important to understand that despite managing to profit to the tune of tens of billions of dollars every year based on massive amounts of user data and increasingly more sophisticated data analytics, tech CEOs will have us believe that somehow mitigating harm from that same data stream is overly burdensome or difficult, and this is simply untrue. From the earliest days, Facebook and YouTube, for example, managed to largely keep adult pornography off their sites. By the way, perfectly legal content, but they didn't want it off on their site. Despite the legality of the content, these platforms decided that this content would be bad for the advertising business, and so they developed really good technology to effectively find and remove this content from their services. Since the passage of here in the US, the 1998 Digital Millennial Copyright Act, the DMCA, online services have been really pretty good at finding and removing copyright infringing material. Despite dragging their heels for years, today, most major online services use photo DNA technology that I was part of developing back in 2008 to find and remove child sexual abuse material. And again, after dragging their heels for years, today, most major online services use similar technology to photo DNA to find and remove very specific, narrowly defined international terror-related material. Beyond these existing technologies to mitigate child sexual abuse, terrorism, and copyright infringement, which we know work, the real power still lies in the underlying recommendation algorithms designed to maximize user engagement. And we saw the power of these algorithms in our own research last year, where we found that in late 2018, nearly 10% of YouTube's recommendations on informational channels like the BBC corresponded to conspiratorial videos. Flat Earth, 5G causes COVID, Bill Gates is trying to inject microchips into your neck types of conspiracies. After years of criticism and pressure from academics, advertisers, and regulators, YouTube in early 2019 announced that they would reduce this type of content. And we watched. And over the intervening 6 months, our analysis showed that the amount of conspiratorial recommendations reduced from 10% to 3%, revealing that all along, YouTube was able to reduce misinformation on their platforms. And what our analysis also showed is that it was actually relatively easy for them to do that because we could see how their algorithms were working by reverse engineering them. The power of the recommendation algorithms also played out in the days before the 2020 presidential election, when Facebook tweaked the recommendation algorithms to favor authoritative news sources. For a few days, the tweak worked. It reduced election-related misinformation on Facebook. But days later, Facebook reversed course, undoing this because they found that their nicer algorithm reduced time spent on Facebook and in turn ad revenue. And so they turned back on the outrage machine. Put simply, technologies exist to find and remove harmful and illegal content. Recommendation algorithms can be tweaked to favor the trustworthy, civil, thoughtful over the lies, hate, and divisiveness. The issues facing us are not primarily technological, but rather one of corporate prioritizing of profits over harm to individuals, societies, and democracies. Lastly, let me just spend a few minutes talking about what are the concerns when we start talking about regulating the tech industry, because there are legitimate concerns when governments start to tell the tech industry how to run their businesses. So it's impossible to talk about the issues that I've been raising without talking about the ideal of the internet that allows for an open and free exchange of ideas. But here's the thing. Social media cannot hide behind the facade that they're creating a neutral marketplace of ideas where good and bad ideas come to compete equally. They don't, because of the recommendation algorithms that favor the outrage. And so Brandeis's concept that the best remedy for falsehoods is more speech, not less, simply doesn't apply in this era of algorithmic curation, manipulation, and amplification. It's also impossible to talk about these issues without talking about the potential for bias based on political, religious, or ideological viewpoint. Despite claims to the contrary, however, study after study after study shows that the current recommendations are not, on balance, politically biased. Despite claims to the contrary, social media is not antagonistic to conservative voices. And in fact, to the contrary, all evidence shows that conservative voices dominate social media in terms of engagement and in terms of benefiting from a less aggressive enforcement of platform rules. Social media, however, today is biased. It's biased towards the most hateful, divisive, outrageous, and conspiratorial content because that's what taps into our worst human instinct and maximizes user engagement and profit. We can and we must do better when it comes to the damage that technology is having on individuals, marginalized groups, societies, and entire democracies. And we can do so, in my opinion, with balancing privacy, freedom of speech, and an open and free exchange of ideas. I'm really looking forward to the conversation, and thank you for letting me kick off the conversation, Lucinda.
Thanks so much, Hany. And we will definitely delve into some of those competing values, I guess, and interests as we go through our discussion. And I know that, you know, from your own background, obviously, you're an expert in the technology, but you've also a lot of experience at this stage of engaging with policymakers and making recommendations. So it'll be interesting to hear about your experiences on Capitol Hill and in Europe in that regard. So we're really lucky, as I said at the start, to be joined by a voice from the European Parliament and a voice from the European Commission. So I think this is, you know, the perfect marriage, if you like, to give us the perspective from Brussels and the European Union. So if I may start with you, Prabhat, and ask you perhaps to give some of your thoughts. As I said earlier, you've been one of the key authors of the proposed Digital Services Act. So interested to hear your thoughts from your own experience and what you think is likely to come down the tracks at a European level.
Yes, thank you, Lucinda, and thank you for the very interesting opening talk by Dr. Farid. I think maybe I'll just make three simple points. I think, first of all, many of the elements that Dr. Farid outlined are a serious concern to the European population at the moment, and they've been a driving force in pushing the Commission to propose regulation of tech companies. I think this is the first major point that I want to make. There is a serious concern about precisely the kind of behavior that you outline, the lack of accountability on certain of these practices, a lack of diligence and consistency in claims that are being made, and generally a perception that the regulatory framework in the European Union is inadequate to frame the behavioral aspects over a wide range of issues that many of which Dr. Farid very eloquently, more eloquently than me perhaps, outlined. So first of all, I think that on the problem analysis, you know, I think I see really many areas of commonality. Of course, in the European Union, maybe that's my second point. We're not starting from a blank sheet of paper when it comes to regulation. I mean, we have the General Data Protection Regulation in place. We have just recently adopted a particular instrument in the area of terrorism, because this is also an area where I think the legislator decided that just relying on the voluntary action by platforms to remove terrorist content was not enough, and that there needed to be some particular rules. There have been rules in the area of copyright, and I would say also there are, you know, I would say maybe the world's most ambitious rules, also not even if they're not hard law, but the action when it comes to combating misinformation and disinformation in particular in the Union. So, and many of the areas of concern have been addressed in one way or the other. So that's my second point. We're not starting from from zero, but the Digital Services Act is building on a piece of paper. Sorry, it's building on an area where we have a lot of experience as well. Now, the third point that I want to make is that the issue of recommender systems and algorithmic amplification, and particularly the link to online advertising, is something that we put into the DSA, and is subject really to the intense discussions with the co-legislators on whether this is the right way, is the best way, is the only way to discuss. And I'm sure Tiemo will speak to that in a moment. But I think it was important for the Commission's perspective to recognize the importance of recommender algorithms and dedicate a particular set of rules to them. Now, there are difficulties to this because, of course, the scope of the Digital Services Act covers a broad range of platforms, and not just the ones that Dr. Farid mentioned in the opening statement. And so, and a broad range of systems. But what we wanted to capture was precisely not just to go beyond the individual notice and takedown logic of individual items, but to go to a more systemic approach and say, how are you organizing your feeds? How are you organizing your systems? And this is something that should be subject to audits. And this is why we introduced the risk assessment methodology, which is subject to regulatory oversight, and which is now very much subject to discussions as well. And again, I think it's recognizing many of the things that Dr. Farid illustrated so eloquently in his. Of course, there are some boundaries where we don't want to go, and you know, we don't want the Digital Services Act to be an instrument to silence voices, either by legitimate voices, you know, either by state action or by private action. Both of those are of great concern to us as well. At the same time, this cannot be an excuse to do nothing in terms of the proliferation of illegal content in the European Union. So that balance has been put in. And a novelty that we put into the risk assessment framework was also to recognize the potential for coordinated manipulation of a service. This is also something that platforms for a long time were denying was actually happening or taking place, at least in public statements. And now, of course, through some internal documents, we see a more complex and nuanced picture emerging, and some of them were already referenced. But I think the outcomes that we're looking for is effective and balanced action, but also an oversight framework that allows regulators or experts to look under the hood and to challenge some of the statements that are being made independently. So maybe I'll just stop here with 3 points, because I think that that you know, a lot of what Dr. Farid said were drivers for the European Union to legislate in this area and to come forward with a regulatory framework, I would say.
You're muted, Lucinda.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. Lots to investigate as we go through this discussion. And I see questions are coming in, and they're very welcome. So please do feel free to submit your questions through the chat function, and we can address some of those in a few minutes. Tiemo, I will now hand over to you to get your perspective. Based on your own experience as rapporteur and following all of these issues intently in your role within the European Parliament, and more broadly, I think we're interested to maybe understand some of the dynamics within the Parliament as well, in terms of the different viewpoints and what are the contentious issues, because we still have quite some way to go in terms of I think reaching agreement on how the co-legislators will ultimately settle on regulating big tech in this area. So over to you, Tiemo. I think you're still muted there. Yeah.
Yeah, I am always muted for security reasons. So I think this is one thing we learned during the last year, always mute yourself. So, but don't forget to unmute. Okay, well, maybe first of all, thank you very much for the invitation, and thanks for the very, very interesting opening statement by Professor Farid. It was very enlightening, to be honest. And I think Prabhat already covered many important areas. So maybe I start with the first point of your question by just trying to explain what happens in the parliament in the moment, because the system, how it works, is of course quite unique. So indeed, the parliament has been working for a very long time on its own initiative reports. So with our initiative reports, we are asking the Commission to come up with a legislative proposal and take into consideration the views of the Parliament. And of course, the Commission is free to to take these ideas into account or not. And I'm happy that with the DSA, the Commission did take on board many ideas which were also discussed and voted positively in the parliament. Not all, but I think this is this is of course normal. So after our initiative reports, the Commission came up with its proposal, which is on the table, which we discuss at the moment. And the lead committee in the European Parliament is now the IMCO committee, so the Committee for the Internal Market. And it's focusing, from my point of view, a little bit too much on the market aspects. So especially in the DSA, which should be especially taking into account the need of social media platforms, we now see more and more elements which apply to market platforms, which is fine, but we need to find the right balance again, I think. And other committees are allowed to submit opinions to the lead committee. And in the JURI committee, the legal affairs committee, where I am working on this proposal, we are at the moment preparing our opinion for the lead committee. So if everything goes well, the Parliament will vote in plenary as one of the two co-legislators at the end of this year. But I think this is still a quite optimistic timeline. So maybe for the this for the internal process in the Parliament, and now reflecting on some points when content-wise. So I think that the DSA is indeed an important step to acknowledge the importance of algorithms and recommender systems in the language, or as the DSA put it in Article 29. So in terms of fighting potential risk of algorithmic amplification, I really believe giving the user a real choice in this context is important, and the Commission proposal, from what I think, includes the option of a non-profiling based recommender system, which I really welcome. But I think we could go a bit further here and demand a chronological opinion option for interaction platforms, for instance. And this is what already Professor Farid highlighted, that it's not possible anymore to have a chronological timeline. And this is, of course, one of the problems. But in this context, I am also very much aware of the issue of dark patterns. So manipulation of users to stick to the platform's preferred option. And we have to make sure that the choice of recommender system is actually a neutral choice based on the user's interest and not influenced by the platform's preferences. And furthermore, transparency and data access are important in the fight against disinformation. And I'm currently looking into strengthening the advertising transparency obligations in Article 30, for instance, by demanding more granular information from platforms regarding the removal of online advertisements and making sure that civil society organizations such as fact checkers have adequate access to data they need to carry out their tasks. But we also need to make sure that the right safeguards are in place. We don't accidentally want to give the next Cambridge Analytica access to sensitive user data. And if I may add 2 or 3 sentences on the advertising issue, because I think this is really the core question here. So as it was already said, so the issue of profiling of users is central. And as was rightly said, when we are looking at the social media algorithms, we really shouldn't forget that there is a user on the other side who necessarily needs to be profiled for the algorithm to work in the first place. So users are, of course, not profiled to send them the best content recommendations, but because companies want to serve them ads. And Facebook and other platforms want to sell ads. So this is the underlying business model of many interactions platforms today. So keep users on the platform for as long as possible by serving them content which the platform thinks that the users will stay longer on the platform because they want to consume the content. And if they stay longer on the platform, they can be shown more targeted advertisement, and this brings more money. So I think the Commission is right that it already raised the standards on transparency in online advertising, so including the targeted personal advertising in Article 24. And I really think it's positive, but we need to be more ambitious. And from the perspective of my political group, the S&D, we have a clear consensus that we want to end the most data invasive practices of digital advertising services online. So the discussion on this is at different stages in different committees. But for my initiative report in JURI, I secured a majority in the parliament. It wasn't the biggest majority ever, but it was a majority. And we asked the Commission to take a look at a complete phase out of tracking ads. And I think this is a huge success. And from what I know, it was the first time that a parliament really said, we want to get rid of tracking advertisements. So now this idea is discussed. I will stop here because I already spoke too long, but I just wanted to make sure that it's clear that we really see the underlying problem of the business model, and that the business model is the core driver of the amplification of content which may be harmful. And we really need to tackle this, and all other solutions may be solutions too, but they wouldn't challenge the problem at the core.
Thank you so much. That's really clear and gives us a good sense of where the debate is in the Parliament, the European Parliament at the moment. I know we have some participants from outside of Europe, from the US and elsewhere. So the rather complicated decision-making process of the European Union is something that we won't explain in great detail today, but the European Parliament is a hugely important part of the process, both in amending Commission legislative proposals and influencing their direction. And I think, Tiemo, you've outlined that very well. Hany, maybe I'll come back to you on the last point, which Tiemo highlighted, which is this success that he has had in securing some support in Parliament for a complete phasing out of tracking ads. Is that something that you think would really impact here? I'm guessing from your earlier contribution that this is something that could be considered quite useful from your point of view.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things in this space is, although we are talking about largely US-based companies, these are global companies, right? And so the impact is felt to some 8 billion people in the world. I don't think it's an overstatement to say that GDPR changed the world. It didn't change it in these sort of deep fundamental, we all have privacy and everything is fine, but it really changed the way the US is now responding to the tech industry and others. So I think regulation coming out of Brussels, out of the UK, is going to have a ripple effect as a model. Now, here on Capitol Hill, there is one of the rare moments of bipartisan agreement is that people are fed up with the technology sector. I mean, truly, from the left to the right, everybody's fed up. Now, interestingly, they're fed up for different reasons. So the right considers the tech industry to be anti-conservative, although there is no evidence to support that claim. And the left sees them as existential threats to societies and democracies. Everybody wants to regulate the tech industry, but we're sort of coming at it from very different ideologies, and that's a little problematic. You've probably heard a lot of talk about Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which gives the technology companies broad protection of liability. There's been some very interesting movement here in the US around that. So a couple of things. There are probably a dozen bills making their way through the House and the Senate side to chip away at the liability protection associated with Section 230. I personally think the most interesting one is the one by Malinowski and Eshoo, Representatives Malinowski and Eshoo, which goes after specifically the recommendation algorithms. And what they say is, and I really like this because I think it's very thoughtful, is we are not going to hold you, Facebook, you, YouTube, Twitter, TikTok, responsible for the billions of uploads every day to your platforms. If you did that, user-generated content platforms would disappear. Now, what they are saying, however, is that if you reach in with a recommendation algorithm or with manual curation and pluck out content and deliver it, put an ad on it and deliver it to a user, well, you have some responsibility for that content. So if you want to truly be a neutral marketplace, fine. But if you want to put your thumb on the scale, well, you're going to hold some liability with that. Now, interestingly, just this week, the Texas Supreme Court struck down Facebook's argument that they should not be held liable for allowing young children to be trafficked on their sites. Facebook was using protection from 230, and the Texas Supreme Court said, no. 230 was meant to protect you from taking down content and from things that people said on your platform. It was not designed to protect you from knowingly allowing bad actors to traffic young children on your platforms. And a lawsuit is now allowed to go forward in Texas. This is really a really critical ruling in the US that has finally started to pierce this bulletproof Section 230. So I think when that liability starts to rise, then the tech companies will start to respond. We've seen the same behavior in the offline world. When companies are held responsible for the harm from their products, the products get safer. And we're starting to see that happen as well. I would love, frankly, to see a coordination, back to your question, Lucinda, between Brussels and the UK and the US and Australia and New Zealand and Canadian and sort of the Western democracies. Because I think this has to be something that is done together, because these are not US or European countries. But I think everybody is learning from everybody else. We are keeping a very careful eye on what's happening coming from across the pond. And my hope is that everything starts to align reasonably well, so we don't have this hodgepodge of rules around the world.
Thank you. Thanks, Hany. I might just bring you in, Prabhat, on this question of liability. Obviously, it goes to the core of all forms of regulation of the internet and tech platforms. And I think it is a question which is somewhat controversial in Brussels as well as in Washington. How far do you think EU regulators can go in pushing liability for tech platforms, and where do you see the sort of the conflict points perhaps with legislators and with the tech industry as we navigate this in the months ahead?
Thanks, Lucinda. You know, for a very long time, the tech conversation was a binary between liability and no liability, and we really didn't have anything else to talk about than whether the safe harbor privileges, which, by the way, are much broader in the US than they are in the European Union, are overbroad or justified or altogether. One thing we wanted to go, and in the European Union, this was discussed very intensely in the context of the copyright reform. And down to the wire, and Tiemo was a big actor in this, and so he'll be sure to have his insights on this as well. In the DSA, we chose not to go that path because we weren't, you know, our conviction was it's the wrong way of attacking a problem. Because first of all, the liability exemptions are a blunt tool. They're a very broad tool, and they hit also big and small enterprises alike, and they are, you know, it's not a fine tool that you want to have. And the top of it, European jurisprudence has linked these liability provisions consistently with fundamental rights, and so deviating from the standards set by courts is a very high threshold, and you need, if you want to deviate from, not only the European Court of Justice but also the European Court of Human Rights, deviating from those standards requires a very high standard of justifications, which frankly, for the type of instrument that we have put on the table, we could not meet this standard. So that's a second perspective. And it's not only about freedom of expression, by the way. This is a very important point. It's also about a protected rights to conduct businesses, which the courts have made. And for us, this you know, well, we may or may not like those judgments, but we have to respect them. You know, so this is one part. So we've chosen another path, which is to leave the liability provisions intact, because they are so fundamentally linked by court judgments to some basic way of doing business. And we actually have this catalog, and very extensive catalog of due diligence obligations, which I actually believe now are much more powerful than actually working via the liability exemptions, which actually fine-tuning a liability exemption is a very hard thing to do. Getting it wrong is a very easy thing to do. You hit all sorts of inadvertent targets that you didn't want to hit. The big companies might not actually care much, you know, ultimately, because you know, even if you remove the safe harbors, you still have to be found guilty of something. And just to be clear on this, is a ruling out from just last week in the European Union on the YouTube judgment, which makes specifically the point about recommender systems not leading to knowledge. So this is the wrong way to go. And so the right way to go is to put clear obligations on platforms and binding obligations that are subject to sanctions, to leverage transparency obligations towards public, towards third parties, because reputational levers are very powerful. We've seen this throughout this. And to have a very powerful oversight mechanism in place that can really look under the bonnet or under the hood, depending where your listeners are from, and allows us to really inspect what's going on, call it out when there's something that's not right, and enter into a serious regulatory dialogue that goes well beyond the self-regulatory initiatives that we've been carrying out. I think this is the approach that we've been taking on liability. I should say also, because Timo's here, you know, is that this also follows a very clear signal from the European Parliament not to touch the liability provisions, you know, which we have fully respected in the Commission's proposal. You know, so this was a boundary condition which the Parliament put in front of the Commission, in which we, in top of the standards set by court, didn't want to deviate from.
Okay, that's a really useful sort of contextual explanation. I think we can probably all agree that self-regulation hasn't worked. So that's a good sort of common ground that we can probably all arrive at. Tiemo, Prabhat has possibly spoken for you, but just maybe a brief thought on that question of liability and alternative mechanisms that maybe deem more appropriate.
Yes, thank you very much. Indeed, Prabhat already covered, almost all points. So the Parliament was really clear on the liability issue. We had this huge fight, and it was really, well, some call it even a war about the copyright regulation. It was well, it wasn't very nice to be in the middle of this fight, to be honest. And in the end, we came up with a regulation which now needs to be transformed or transported into national laws. And not all member states already did this exercise. So it's very, and one of the main concerns, especially by civil society, is that lawful, legal postings would be maybe blocked or could be deleted by so-called upload filters, so by algorithms checking the uploaded content. And yes, technology can be a solution, but I think that when it comes to the freedom of speech, when it comes to societal issues, we cannot solve the problems with technologies. And that's why the Parliament really said, no, we do not want to change the liability rules as they are. So, however, so I really believe that we need to limit the negative impact of algorithmic amplifications, yes. We need to keep, on the other hand, a balance with fundamental rights, as Prabhat said, and the European Court of Justice just last week said it again. And if we need to increase liability of platforms, I'm afraid this could lead to overblocking, because platforms would tend to delete content or block content because they fear any sanctions. And this would, in the end, make platforms a worse place for all of us, because yes, they are problematic and they are far away from being perfect, but at least they give many people the possibility to interact with each other, to be creative. And that's why the Parliament is really careful about the right balance. And so that's why we are happy with the Commission's proposal so far, or in this regards. And if you allow me one last sentence on what Professor Farid already said, yes, we need cooperation between different countries, especially between the US and the European Union, because we need to apply rules which are applicable in more countries to have to get a general rule, a general understanding. And I'm quite optimistic that with the new administration and the new contacts between the US and the EU, we will see increased cooperation. And it was quite interesting for me to see that in Washington, similar ideas are discussed as in Europe when it comes, for example, to the Digital Markets Act. So how to tackle killer acquisitions, for example. And I see a lot of parallels and good points for cooperation. And I think that this is really needed and a good point.
Thank you for that. Hany, I might come back to you because we've just been through the process of the terrorist content online regulation, which happily has been fully approved now in plenary by the European Parliament, and will come into effect next year. And this question, which Tiemo has hit on in relation to upload filters and proactive measures, the European Parliament took a very negative view. I think, obviously you have advocated very specific methods of applying upload filters, which might be worth just exploring a little bit, because it's relevant in this context as well.
So first of all, let's be clear, everything has an upload filter. Every single piece of email that you get is going through a filter, checking for spam, malware, viruses, ransomware. And if we decide we don't want filters on any content, we may as well just turn off our computers now because we're all in a lot of trouble. So let's stop with the hysteria and let's talk up seriously that if we think it is reasonable to protect our individual computers from malware and viruses and spam, well, then let's talk about all the harms that are online. Now, having said that, I think you do want to tread very lightly here. So, for example, the technologies that we have been proposing, particularly things like photo DNA around child sexual abuse, are not filters that try to make a determination about the actual piece of content. What these technologies say is, this is a piece of previously identified child sexual abuse. This is a bomb-making video. This is a piece of content that has been outlawed. It has been determined by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the Canadian Center for Child Protection, Interpol, whatever the agency is that are experts in this. And our terms of service say, you cannot transmit this, and we are going to block it. And that's essentially what spam and malware do. They have signatures associated with specific types of content, and they block them at upload. And those types of very targeted, very specific, transparent pieces of technology, I think, are proportional responses to the threat of billions of pieces of child sexual abuse material where the average age is 8 years old, to bomb-making videos that tell people how to create explosive and carry out attacks. Those are proportional responses, and I think they keep our societies and our individuals safe. And so I think it's fair to say we do not want to deploy face recognition, full-blown AI that is trying to infer intent from your email and your post. Fair enough. I think that's a perfectly reasonable position to take, particularly given where the technology is today. But I think it's also reasonable to say for these very highly targeted, extremely accurate, with a precedent for how these technologies work, we should be deploying these technologies to protect the most vulnerable among us. Those are very reasonable and balanced technologies, in my opinion.
Okay.
Can I say one more thing, Lucinda? Sorry. Tiemo said something that I think is important that we haven't talked enough about. So here in the US, there's a lot of talk about antitrust, that we have a virtual monopoly among 5 companies. And the reason why I think that's important is that here in Silicon Valley, I'm here, I can see San Francisco from my office window here. I'm in the heart of Silicon Valley. There's no oxygen in the room for competitors. We've been talking about business models for a while now. And the reason why there's only one business model is because there's only 5 companies and they all have the same business model. And anytime a competitor comes along with their trillions of dollars, they just come in and they just wipe them off the map. And we need oxygen in the online ecosystem to create competitors, to create better business models and to protect them. And by the way, when Google steps in and tells you, no, you shouldn't be doing this, would you please remind them that the reason we have Google today is because the US Department of Justice stepped in and stopped Microsoft from absolutely demolishing them with their power. So that type of antitrust really works. And the reason why Google is who Google is, despite them having revisionist history, is because the government stepped in and created a fair marketplace for the Google of the world to survive. And I think we should do that again for better business models for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thanks, Hany. And certainly DG competition on this side of the Atlantic has been trying to level the playing field, but it's difficult when you have such dominant players in the market, but it's definitely something that's been explored by EU policymakers. I'm very conscious that we are up against the clock, and I want to give everybody a final opportunity to wrap up. One just interesting thing, which you've all in different ways talked about the need for multilateral approaches and solutions, and obviously the transatlantic partnership being the kind of the key focus. But the New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern recently at the gathering of the Christchurch call participants, signees, called or advocated for something called ethical algorithms, which sounds nice. And I'm just curious, perhaps whether you have thoughts on that as something that's practical or realistic, or is it just a nice phrase? And please, I'd invite each of you to conclude with any particular observations. We have some questions which I did not manage to get to. Hany has kindly directly answered in written form, so I'd encourage everybody to take a look at his responses there. And there may be one or two questions that we just didn't manage to cover, and I do apologize, but I want to try and keep to the time. So Tiemo, I will come back to you, followed by Prabhat, followed by Hany. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. So very quickly, this sounds, of course, as a great idea, but I think it's really hard to get there. And unfortunately, we overestimate what algorithms can do. And especially when it comes to the question of an ethical AI, I would be, or even only an ethical algorithm, it doesn't need to be in artificial intelligence. I would be very careful, to be honest. Especially as you, so I think you need to on the one hand, you have fundamental rights, and on the other hand, you have ethical aspects. So I think fundamental rights are enforceable and should be distinguished from ethical, from ethics, right? So as a lawyer, for me, this is very important, to be honest. So, and then the question is, what is ethical? And ethical, it's hard to define, even within the European Union. And take a look at Hungary, for example. The new anti-LGBTQI law is considered as ethical for the Hungarian government, but not for the rest of Europe or almost all other governments in Europe. So that's why I'm quite reluctant to say, yes, ethical algorithms would solve the problem, because it's hard to define what is ethical or what ethical means. Yeah.
Thank you. Prabhat.
Yes, thanks. I think the question is not so much, I mean, I tend to agree with Tiemo on this point. I mean, the question is not so much what is ethical and what is not ethical. The question is, how are we going to know anything? And what, you know, the problem is not so much whether somebody claims that their algorithm or their system is ethical or beneficial, and somebody makes a counterclaim to that. The question is, what tools do the regulators need to actually come to an independent assessment, whether one thing or the other is true or not, and what levers do we have to take corrective measures when something goes wrong? And so this is the approach that we've been trying to take in the DSA, is to go beyond the kind of, you know, public-facing statements, you know, on both sides, you know, that, you know, everything is wonderful or everything is terrible. I mean, this is not a way of making policy in this space. You know, we need data, we need insight, we need access to internal functioning, we need, and, you know, of course, this also means that we need regulators who are well-equipped and technically versed to actually carry out this. I believe in the Commission, and you mentioned already the competition experience that we have at the European competition, where we're monitoring, for example, antitrust remedies on algorithms such as Google Shopping for a long period of time. We've built up a lot of experience in this area, and I think we're capable of doing it. But of course, some of this will be distributed also to member states, and collectively can be done. But so I think a better phrasing is this: that we should all strive for ethical outcomes, and the highest, and you know, this should be a given in a society, and we should take the tech companies by their word, and when they claim that they. But we need to have control mechanisms in place, and we need to have coercive corrective measures in place that actually nudge them to do the right thing, and this is what we try to do in the DSA.
Thank you. So, Hany, the final word to you.
I'm sensitive to time. I'll keep it short. I think Prabhat and Tiemo said it exactly right. Defining ethics is very difficult. There's a lot of discussion in the academic community on fairness and ethical AI, but there are no really clear definitions. And look, don't get me wrong. I think Prime Minister Erdogn has exactly the right sentiment. But what I would say is we need ethical CEOs. The algorithms are designed by us. So let's not put the blame on the algorithms. The reality is that the CEOs are making decisions that are leading to problems. And so let's focus on the human aspect, and the technology will take care of itself.
That's a fantastic way to wrap up our discussion. We have a lot of work, I suspect, to do in that particular area. I'd like to thank our excellent panelists for a really excellent, interesting and fast-moving discussion. So thank you so much. For anybody who would like to learn more about the Counter-Extremism Project, about our position papers on the Digital Services Act, TCO, our studies and investigations into various tech platforms and indeed extremist and terrorist organizations globally, please log on to our website, fightextremism.com. Where we also have our all of our podcast episodes, Fighting Terror, which you can link to through the website or indeed through your usual sources of podcast. Once again, thank you to everybody who joined us this afternoon. Thanks to our panelists. Thank you for a really good debate, and let's keep in touch and keep this discussion going as policymakers tackle this very complex